Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for this talk with Rachel. This is part of Develop's dry season talk series programming. Dry season is basically over now. It's very wet in the Philippines, so may have to like change the season name soon. But just to give a bit of context on where this talk is coming from, um, Develop, which is this organization for critical and poetic technologies in the Philippines, has been doing a lot of online and offline programming since 2016 that really picked up during the pandemic and still continues on to now. And we basically gather as a community of practice that um, want to broaden the definition of technology and kind of research, write, make, and just talk and steward our practices together. So we do things like host events and friends who are often like emerging technologists. So we just have this like peer network, and Rachel in particular was very involved in development programming. So it's like full circle moment bringing her back here. So I'm very looking forward to host her. Um, so we host programming like this, and then we also collectively create artifacts, write, publish, and lately have been making a lot of artistic interventions about what it means to be a more intentional technologist and cultivate a more intentional relationship with technology through better tools, spaces, general practices and rituals, which is a perfect segue, I guess, to Rachel's topic. So I'm gonna read a bit about her description and talk a bit about why she fits into this program in particular. Chak is a Filipino Chinese designer, researcher, and DJ currently living in London. With a background in health sciences, she seeks to use technology as a generative tool towards a shared future of mutual well being. Rachel traverses tech startups and is also one half of Studio Bisita, a web studio crafting websites to amplify the on ground work of Filipino NGOs, such as For the Future, Local Lab, and Museo Pambata. Um, and today she'll be talking a bit about cultivating softer relationship with technology, her research in rediscovering Filipino circularity, and her role and work and practice as a designer, along with the possibilities of design's roles in uplifting culture and heritage. So this whole talk series for this dry season that we've been putting together so far has been kind of themed around inviting a lot of designers foremost, first and foremost, who think about archives, objects, memory, culture, and care um, with a kind of like special attention. So I'm excited for Rachel to be bringing in like a very complex and multifaceted like perspective on culture, and to learn a bit more about like how all her adjacencies have been informing her work. Um, she's a huge gatherer, thinker, and writer, and I've always admired like her presence and how she shows up. And of course, her design work is gorgeous. So I'm so very excited to hear a bit more about her projects and what she's been up to as of late. Um, so I'll let her take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Gia, for the intro. And yeah, as Gia said, this really is like a full circle moment because Develop has played such a role in my journey into getting to design and tech. So yeah, I'm really excited for this space. So I'll just get started. Let me share my screen. Okay. So welcome, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about this relationship between remembering relationality and technology. And before I go into talking about myself, I kind of wanted to create some intentions and some invitations. Basically, I wanted this space and this talk to be a way for me and for anyone else to process a lot of the shifts in our lives that we maybe never got to because of 2020, because of the current pace of the world and what's going on. I want this space to also be an ode to all the people across time and place that have influenced me in my work. And I also feel like I don't have all the answers. I've mostly been in this space of just trying to gather and collect a lot of research and perspectives. And I said this already, but yeah, to process a lot of what's happening in the world and to bear witness to what we're all experiencing individually and collectively. And if any thoughts come up during this talk, to grab a pen and paper and write down any of your thoughts. There won't be any space like where you're sharing, but just to keep it for yourself. So a little bit of context on what has shaped me, my craft, and my work. I've had the privilege of growing up between multiple cultures and communities. I was born in Nigeria and then went back home to Philippines and spent some time in China and then university in the US, and then now I'm currently in London. But I would always go back home to Philippines, and witnessing like such different realities was sometimes very complicated for my identity, but at the same time, I really saw a lot of like parallels in the communities that I've been in. And so that has really shaped my work. And I have a background in health science. I actually graduated college in 2020 with thinking I would go into pre-med and health sciences. And then when 2020 happened, I actually shifted my career into design. And I talk a little bit about that in this talk, but yeah, I decided to switch my career into design, do my own independent research. And now I'm currently working as a product designer at a startup, but I like to traverse both the tech space and the nonprofit space. And a lot of the work that I do also is being one half of Studio Visita with Nikki, who's on the call right now. But we very much explore our craft in design through the Filipino lens and just finding ways to use technology to help the on-ground change that's happening with local NGOs in the Philippines. And when I'm not designing, I'm DJing, and I love curating sounds from all over the world. So with remembering, I actually wanted to go back to 2020 because I feel like 2020 was such a pivotal time for myself. So going back to what created a lot of shifts, I was actually in the US in 2020, and I was witnessing a lot of parallels between like the different, as I said, like different cultures that I've been a part of. And a lot of parallels, for example, with in Nigeria, there was some protests happening with the youth coming out and speaking up against the government, with using excessive police force against people in Lagos. And then at the same time, I was watching this. This was also around the same time as the anti-terror law in bill in the Philippines that was happening. And at the same time, I was witnessing the BLM protests in the US and just also our collective going through the pandemic. And so it made me question a lot of where I was in my career and if I was really aligned with um, how I was serving like my different communities. And what I realized is that a lot of these problems were interconnected, and with interconnected problems call for interconnected solutions. And so I went into this process of remembering, and with remembering comes reconstructing, and with reconstructing comes deconstructing. So since 2020, I've been in this period of just asking a lot of questions and deconstructing my education, where I grew up, and all of that. And so a lot of that informs the research that I'm going to be showing here. And I wanted to share this book actually, but when I was trying to figure out if I should switch my career from the sciences into design and tech, or even just some career that would answer a lot of the questions that I had. One professor that I spoke to recommended this book, Small is Beautiful. And there was this quote that really gave me language to a lot of the feelings that I was like battling inside. And it says that our task and the task of all education is to understand the present world, the world in which we live and make choices. The problems of education are merely reflections of the deepest problems of our age. They cannot be solved by organization, administration, or the expenditure of money, even though the importance of all these is not denied. We are suffering from metaphysical disease, and the cure must therefore be metaphysical. Education, which fails to clarify our central convictions, is mere training or indulgence. For it is our central convictions that are in disorder, and as long as the present anti-metaphysical temper persists, the disorder will grow worse. And so a lot of this made me question, was my education system and was, even the internships that I was doing, was it all aligned with my values? And I started to think about, when I was in the sciences, like what actually made me fall in love with being in the sciences. And I realized, I still remember the first time that I actually like fell in love with the sciences. I was taking this neurobiology class, and it was a class that I took really randomly. I always thought I was never a science person because I just thought like I wasn't good at it. And then there was this video that our professor showed of what happens on our body on a cellular level. And this photo that I have here, this GIF that I have here, is a structure of dining. And dining are kind of like, if you think of them like cargo trucks, and they're like delivering all the nutrients that our bodies need. And it's what helps, our muscles grow and our body just move. And so thinking about like, wow, the parallels of how our body is full of different systems that are all coordinating together to help us work and stay alive. And then thinking about um, in nature, how in forests and the networks, the mycelium networks, they all communicate with one another. They all communicate which areas of the forest need more nutrients. They all learn which areas are more detrimental. And it's always this constant like communication and being in a relationship to one another. And then zooming out into just learning about like different regions of the world and how there's always so many parallels. I started thinking about this concept of microcosm, macrocosm, that existence is fractal, that the health of the cell is also the health of the species and is also the health of the planet. And so for me, why I was in well-being is because why I was in health sciences, because I saw well-being as interconnected. I saw that our individual connection is very much encompassed within our communal connection and is also with our connection to our environment. Our environment spaces, both in the physical and the digital. So I started this platform called Malaya World, and it was really like a container for me because I remember I was doing this internship at this company. I was doing like a social media internship. And I remember they speak about values of community and connection, and that's what they were trying to create. And I remember pitching to them this idea of, oh, what if, we talk about how like the whole systems thing of connection, of how it relates to like our sense of community, our sense of space, all of that. And I got shut down immediately. They just said like it was too out there or just did not make sense for their brand. And so that was kind of like a fire in me that was like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to create my own thing if I can't find the space for that there. So I created Malaya World, and a lot of it was just this thinking of like, okay, how can I explore blueprints for a world where humans, technology, and nature work harmoniously together, what's already existing out there. And I use this as a way to just gather a lot of resources together. One of my favorite platforms is Arena. Arena basically changed my life. I always say that it was basically like me creating my own syllabus. And so in this idea of, can humans, science, technology, and nature work harmoniously together? I want to bring up this question of first asking or inviting you guys to ask yourselves, what is your relationship to technology right now? How do you feel with the gadgets that you own? How do you feel when you enter social media? What is your body's response? And what is the type of spaces that you want to feel like with the internet? You don't have to answer, but just simmer on that question. Um, and so for me, I think about I had to go back into my first interactions with the internet. And for me, this is like my OG tech stack. This was like I went on Club Penguin a lot and met so many people from all over the world on Club Penguin. It was just my favorite place on the internet, just such a safe space. Going to like the coffee shops in Club Penguin and like making pizza. And then Tumblr was also such a safe space for expressing. I had so many different accounts and yeah, it was just, I miss those early internet days and coming home from school and going on Yahoo Messenger. And back then in the internet, where you had that separation where you could still say, you know, gotta go. But now our worlds kind of seem like blended in. And now I realized there was a point where I realized that I was feeling really glued to all my devices. And coming from a health science background, I was just like, this does not feel good in my body. This does not feel good for my nervous system. Um, it's clearly not the relationship that I want to have with my devices because I'm suddenly feeling called to buy so many things and consume so many things. And yeah, it's like also that feeling when you eat a lot of like junk food and then you just feel so fried. So I think I was just exhausted with feeling that way. And then also thinking about the way that tech corporations and our institutions can exploit workers through tech. Like in the Philippines, a lot of labor workers are doing content moderation. And we also see that our government politicians use Facebook in order to fuel misinformation. Right now, we're seeing with Palestine, the way AI is used to direct bombing. It's just really heartbreaking. And with Congo, seeing that we all have, you know, all these access to our devices, but it's at the expense of people as well. So I think a lot of that was what made me really get into the space of like, I really want to understand my relationship to technology and being in tech now, I really want to understand my responsibility within tech. And so, yeah, we are in a place in tech where a lot of it is taking away our attention. We're drowning in this age of information, but we're also starving for wisdom. And I think it's important to realize that our world is a product of centuries of people that have come before us, stories, actions, decisions, all shaping the world we inhabit now. It's not completely random. And this quote is also from one of my favorite documents, Letters to a Young Technologist. I actually found it through Develop. So shout out to that. And so thinking about the ways that we share meaning as a collective, I wanted to talk about this concept of social imaginary. So the social imaginary is the imaginary system that holds society together. It's the web of shared meanings and rules that guide our collective and individual actions and values. And the way that our social imaginaries are shaped are through many different phases and cycles of socialization. You know, we're born into this world where we have no information, we don't have any biases yet. We're just very curious about experiencing the world through our senses and our bodies. And then we get socialized based on our personal relationships, what values they hold, and then in the institutions that we're brought into, what values those institutions uphold. And, we get to this place of maybe we have some internalizations. And so it's this period where we can either turn the direction into change or do nothing and repeat that cycle of socialization. And so thinking about models and stories and how they're tools for sense making, models are explained by stories and stories create models. So I wanted to introduce some stories. I think that science fiction is actually a really great way of reflecting the stories and social imaginaries of our collective. So in the 1960s, there was the boom of this aesthetic and this story of steampunk, and a lot of it was influenced by the Industrial Revolution. Steampunk envisions a world where steam-powered technological advancements are at the forefront. And then in the 1980s, we saw, tech digital boom. And so it's influenced by the digital revolution. And this idea of cyberpunk is actually more of a warning against unchecked corporation power of being in late stage capitalism. It's a world with high tech, but low life and low nature. And so a lot of those stories are actually more on the negative side, and they reflect back to us, that we are in a burnt out society living in the culmination of centuries of capitalistic economic systems, amplified by neoliberal social imaginaries. And what that basically means is these things here. So the focus became on individual achievement and profiting as an individual, relying on yourself to make a living. So that became a lack of social support. Governments were defunded, things like education, and unemployment benefits, and just a lot of social welfare programs were defunded in order to boost more privatization. And that made our relationships very transactional. It created this philosophy that all human needs and interactions are viewed through the lens of the market, that competition is not just within the marketplace, but also within our personal and professional relationships, and that growth at all costs, even at the expense of the land and people. In this book, this author, Byung-Chul Han, wrote in this book, Burnt Out Society. He wrote that we have switched from a disciplinary society into an achievement society. And so the society of achievement is a society of self-exploitation. The society does not operate by means of commands and prohibitions, but seduces and leads us into voluntary self-optimization and self-exploitation. So a lot of it is talking about like this pressure that we have to constantly do more and be more. And it can weigh a lot because it's something that's intangible and something that can feel like it's self-inflicted. But a lot of it is also the systems, telling us that we have to do more and be more. And so I talk a lot about that because in thinking about remembering our relationship to technology, it's actually really also in the immaterial, it's like in the immaterial. It's in remembering our relationship to our inner and outer world. And so this narrative now that's been becoming more popular is the idea, the aesthetic and idea of solar punk. And it's now more the positive side of having a relationship with technology. It envisions a regenerative world rooted in communal living, in technology that lives in symbiosis with nature. You can see it in a lot of like Studio Ghibli movies. I love Studio Ghibli movies. And a lot of it is very much, buildings with greenery, but I also want to ask this question of how do we make sure solar punk is not just aesthetic romanticization without any groundedness in the now. And again, it's about going from the material into the relational. So I always return back to this quote and thinking about my relationship to technology. I think about technology was not given so humankind can ride roughshed over nature and wreak irreparable changes. Rather, technology is to draw out the hidden essence of all nature so that it can sparkle with new purpose. Technology is not to enslave and command life, but to draw forth the infinite possibilities locked within all life and to open up new realms of significance. Thus, it is that we need to heed the message of life and nature to create new interfaces infused with nature's wisdom. And I also have been reading this book called Resonance, a Sociology of Relationship to Our World. And it very much talks about, again, this problem of the problem is really the relationships. Problematic relationships to the world are not only a consequence of acceleration and compulsion to escalate in modern society, but also their cause. We're in a self-reinforcing circular problem. So in thinking about what I mentioned about fractals and how the micro parallels to the macro, I also think about that with time and as a collective as well. So there's this quote, the Italian philosopher Vico had this theory that time moves more in a spiral than it does in a line. He believes that's why we repeat ourselves, including our tragedies. And if we are more faithful to this movement, then we can move away from the epicenter through distance and time, but we have to confront it every time. So collectively as well, like throughout generations, we are shown patterns, and it's kind of up to us to confront it as well and, you know, break that cycle. And the inspiration here for when I was putting this talk together, the idea of remembering, I actually got from Lenny Struggle, who has been doing amazing work as well. She says, when I talk about decolonization as the work of remembering, to remember is to put back together all the parts of the self that we have been disconnected from as colonized subjects, because colonialism is all about dispossession of the land primarily, and then dispossession of our value system, our cultural traditions and practices that we have been severed from. And this book, The Philippines is Not a Small Country, actually was came into my life at such a pivotal time because I was having all these questions of why have I always felt small being Filipino, and also finding that I would always compare myself to the West, always feel like I wasn't enough to the West. And he talks a lot about how, yeah, in the Philippines, you know, and I think this is changing for sure, but this idea of smallness, you know, in Philippines we say hiya, and I was definitely always feeling that, thinking of the Philippines as, he says, thinking of the Philippines as a small country can foreclose possibilities and in the process reinforce, for whatever reasons people have for thinking that we are small in the first place. We are who we are because we forget, but also we are who we are because we remember. So only with a proper sense of history can a nation move from the tragedies of its past and pursue a better future. And so I started to reframe, you know, I would always hear like, oh, we're so behind on things, and we're such a developing country, and we're a third world country. But then realizing that this metric of being a third world country is also made by the West and is also labels put on us. And so thinking about in a more regenerative way of we're not just a developing country, we're a country healing from 500 years of colonization. So I've been in this process of remembering Filipino circularity. And one of the light bulb moments that came together, because yeah, that concept of microcosm, macrocosm was always something that I felt, but then when I actually found language that existed within our culture in the Philippines, it was like, whoa, finally, I don't know, it just felt like a moment of alignment. And it's this idea of kapwa. It's a Filipino indigenous psychology. And basically this psychologist, Virgilio Enriquez, he also studied in the US and then went back home to the Philippines to see if he could apply the same lessons that he learned in the US, and then realized that it just did not fit us. Like as Filipinos, we are more relational, we're more community oriented. And so having a very individualized Western psychology just didn't didn't align. And so he went and studied from more rural areas, the provinces in the Philippines, because Manila is still, influenced by the West. And so coming together, this idea of kapwa, it's this recognition of shared identity that our inner self, our loob, is interconnected and interwoven to others and to the natural world and to the spiritual world. And so it's the shift from the individual to the interconnected. And then similar with kaluluwa, it's like this idea of our spirit, our soul beyond, and that something exists even after death and returns to our environment. So again, showing that circularity has always been within us. We've always been inherently practicing it. And this is one of my favorite paintings from Anita Magsaysay, and she has a lot of her paintings are very much inspired by Filipino women, and yeah, would recommend checking out her work. And so yeah, Kaluluwa is the shift from competition into continuum, that everything and all of us are interconnected over time. And I've also been influenced and shaped a lot by the work of Siko Diwa on Instagram. He is reviving a lot of Filipino psychology and this idea. I really love this essay that he wrote on different baybayin words and just breaking down Filipino language. And so there's this ha in the Philippines, like hangin, it's like wind. And he said, when someone passes away, we say that their breath was taken away. And ka in Filipino, like kapatid, kaibigan, like these are all relational words. And so in the baybayin, you can see that it's basically it's like this showing of two souls always being connected by the middle. And so even in our language, there's this idea of like interconnectedness. And so thinking about, technology as like different tools, and technology and tools by how it's been in the more like capitalistic sense has been a tool of domination more. And so Ursula Le Guin in her book Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, she actually proposes thinking about tools as more regenerative, as thinking about if the first tool was more of a basket, more of a carrier bag versus a spear that represents domination, what would our relationships to technology look like? She says, before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home. Before the tool that spears, the tool that drags, the tool that kills, there's a tool that collects, the tool that contains. And I always go back to this way of thinking because I think about how even in moments of crisis, what we see is a lot of sharing, a lot of gathering, a lot of humans coming together versus this idea of being separated. And so thinking about that, I saw that in our culture in the Philippines, thinking about our history of weavers and how it shows up in many different ways. I was watching this movie called The Dream Weaver, and there's this concept of the Dream Weavers of the Tiboli, this cloth. Basically, they receive patterns in their dreams, and then they're able to weave it into these like cloth. And I think that's so mind-blowing, the connection you must have in order to do that, and just how that has been passed down through generations. And working later, I'll share as well, but working with like different NGOs who are also still trying to preserve that culture of weaving. Yeah, and then also thinking about in the Philippines that we also have our own nature-based technology that is very much informed by local ecological knowledge. And there's this researcher, Julia Watson. She travels around the world, studying different indigenous communities around the world. And she also studied within the Philippines. And she studied the rice terraces with the people of Ifugao. And growing up, I always saw these rice terraces and I never thought too much about them. I just thought, yeah, like they're so beautiful, but realizing that, they were carved 2,000 years ago and that the indigenous people, the mountain people were so in tune with it that they created this whole architectural system that is both a purification system that preserves the biodiversity that gives to the people and just creating a more symbiotic way of living and also a more climate resilient way. And so it brings this question of, while modern societies were trying to conquer nature in the name of progress, indigenous cultures have been learning to work with nature. Is it possible to expand our definition of contemporary technology and find a middle ground between high tech and indigenous technology? Can we shift from extraction into integration? And so how do we orient our values, thinking about where some of our systems are and the values that they perpetuate, things being transactional, how do we shift it into being more relational, folk individualism or excessive individualism, introducing more communal and collaborative nature, going from extractive to reciprocal, exploitative to being in stewardship with both land and people, going from excessive global growth into tuning into our local wisdom, what's within our local community, and instead of just using labor, but actually building capacity within people. And instead of just going technological solutionism, that technology is the answer to everything, but actually incorporating more traditional ways of communicating with technology, with indigenous technology. What does that look like? And I also think about how in the Philippines, we have experienced, we're very resilient people. We get used to experiencing typhoons. And this becomes a very, a normalized thing. But then the way that I see how we get back and also how we care for one another in order to get through some of the hardships that we're experiencing back home, the way that our communities come together. When I was back home in the Philippines, I was working with a nonprofit local lab, and then around that time was Typhoon Odette, and it basically wiped out 80% of the island. And I remember it being such a scary time because so many people lost their homes. But at the same time, I was seeing how many of the different organizations, but also many people from all over the country came together to pull in resources for many different parts of the Philippines that were affected by this typhoon. And so we've always had that. We always had that coming together. And so with that, I kind of want to share how I've been, inspired by our Filipino culture and how it shapes my practice in using technology and design to amplify Philippines' distributed web of care um, that leads me into what I've been practicing right now. The first I wanted to share about Studio Visita that I practice with Nikki. And Studio Visita is basically a container for us to explore how technology and design can amplify on-the-ground change, to create space for Filipino identities online, and to practice, also to just figure out our craft and to have a container to practice our craft. It's really interesting because Nikki and I actually met on Arena, and we really connected because of all these like shared dreams that we had in understanding like our Filipino culture and also like reclaiming our Filipino culture. And so it's also felt like a full circle moment, all the projects that we've done together. And the first project that we did together was For the Future. And this was also a full circle moment because when I was in the Philippines, I was attending workshops as well. And I remember seeing For the Future and being like, "Oh, I really want to work with them. Like they're doing such amazing work." And so to finally have that opportunity to work with them and see the amazing work that's been going on, there's this whole, oh, we want to build, a sustainable future, but then realizing that it is also something that exists right now. There is so much on the ground work that is already doing that. And For the Future basically goes out to many different communities in the Philippines, and they use art and storytelling as a medium to kind of bridge uh, on their social media platform to kind of like humanize the climate movement. And they post on their, so we use the website as a way to basically collect all these stories from different areas that they have worked with. And we created a donation flow within the website so that you could read the story, get to understand the communities, and have an accessible way to support them either through a monthly subscription or a one time. And so really thinking about, okay, websites could be a really cool way of amplifying NGOs. And I actually also got to work with Local Lab. Local Lab is an NGO in Siargao. And actually in 2018, I visited one of their community spaces before I knew anything about them. And I remember also being in that space and I saw, there was a workshop going on with the the locals teaching tourists how to weave. And I remember just being like, wow, this is so cool. Like, I want to work with them as well. And then flash forward to like 2020 or 2021, I got to uh, get introduced to their team and started like interning for them until I was able to create a website with them with Nikki under Visita. And Local basically around Siargao, an island in the Philippines, they have many different projects. Their scope of work is actually insane. They have compost sites in the Philippines. They have regenerative farms. They have a tropical academy, which was supposed to be here, but the photo didn't show up. But and a lot of this are all interconnected too, where they also have restaurants and any waste from the restaurants go into these composting sites, and then these composting sites then go into the regenerative farms, and then regenerative farms also feed their restaurants and snack shops and their community centers. So this whole idea of circularity is very embedded in their work. And so it was really fun working with them to create their website and to figure out how to use design to communicate that whole scope of work. And so we created different diagrams for them. We created a whole website also in the website introducing a lot of storytelling, talking about, what the issue is within the Philippines right now, but also the solutions that they're finding, talking about how the Philippines used to be, how we're bringing the Philippines to being back to being self-sustainable. And a really cool thing about Local Lab is also that their goal is actually to create projects where their local community is part of it and is leading it. And that once their community has the tools and training to lead those projects, that they could kind of back away. And so it's really this difference in, again, capacity building and skills and training in that. And lastly, I wanted to talk about a recent project that Nikki and I have also been working on, and we actually haven't shown this to anyone. So I wanted to show it here for the first time. So it's called Kapit Bahay, and actually I need to switch screens that I'm sharing. All right, so we have been basically curating as well all the different orgs, all the different creators, coalitions, NGOs, physical spaces that very much embody a lot of these principles of imagining better futures in the Philippines and realizing that a lot of them are in this ecosystem where they all collaborate with each other, which is also another cool thing that I realized about again, that distributed web of care in the Philippines. So we can share this link, and if anyone wants to check it out and also check out all these amazing work that's being done, feel free to. And as well, created a living library, basically with all of the resources that have influenced our practice. And so you see some of the ones that I referenced in this talk. And okay, let me go back to Figma. Um, that is basically it. I wanted to end actually with one of my favorite books right now. It's called Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. And it's basically a book about a tea monk has this calling to explore something outside of his normal daily life. He just feels like this sense of calling to go on an adventure, and he goes on an adventure. And this period of time is also way in the future when robots have actually gained consciousness and they decide to separate from humanity because they don't want anything to do with humanity. They want their freedom. And so humans have let them go. And so it's kind of like this myth of like, oh, robots. And so he runs into a robot in the forest, and they basically just go on an adventure together and ask each other a lot of questions, trying to understand the human perspective, trying to understand the robot technology perspective. And there's a scene where Dex, the human, he tells Moscap, he says, "You're so flexible, so fluid. You don't even know how many you are there, how many of you there are and where you are. You just go with the flow. I figured you'd all be numbers and logic, structured, strict." Moscap looked amused. What a curious notion. Is it, like you said, you're a machine? And and the machine only works because of numbers and logic. And Moscap says that's how we function, not how we perceive. And so it goes back to this whole idea of, we see things as components, as materials that we're made of, but we're more than how we function and the materials we're made of. We're also how we experience the world and how we perceive. And if we hold that perspective to technology as well, I wonder, what type of relationship can we have with technology? What type of things can we build with technology? Yeah, so just wanted to share that. And that's basically the end of my talk.
Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your practices, your influences, inspirations. I'm sure everyone is very excited to dig into this web that you've weaved. I'll open up the floor to any questions that people have, and I can share some of my own, but we can move to do a Q&A for the next 10 to 20 minutes. I'll begin with a question that was dropped in the chat earlier. And I'll read out each question, but if anyone in the audience wants to speak up themselves, just feel free to raise your hand or let me know in the chat and I'll unmute you. But first I'll read Angela's question. Do you think that right now it's possible to cultivate indigenous internet spaces beyond micro communities? I understand that groups like Studio Bisita focus on on-ground change, but I'm curious whether you've had ideas on introducing healthier media consumption and production values at a time of infamy and algorithms that drive division rather than connection.
Let me just sit with that question for a little bit. Beyond micro communities. So when I think about I guess this idea of indigenous internet spaces, and again, those values that I mentioned, the idea of being reciprocal, the idea of thinking non-linearity. I've actually been, I don't know if it's beyond my group communities, but I guess I've been observing a lot of, yeah, different internet communities and different internet creators who have also been trying to embody these values and these like principles of having a healthier relationship to media. And there's like this the whole movement of like the poetic web, and I think also this movement of like teaching people to have their own websites so that they can create their own environment so that they want to be in. Yeah, I don't know if I know specific or some that are coming to my mind right now other than that. But I do think that also on Arena, I see a lot of these principles. I think everyone on Arena is kind of like building on their own internal world, and a lot of it is like based on their values and what they're curious about. I see a lot of like parallels in those principles. I hope that made sense.
I had a similar question, um, that I guess might be an interesting follow-up, but I was looking through the arena, and I've been following the development of, I guess, the neighbors and Kapitbahay project, as you guys were doing research. And something that struck me was its description as a site archipelago, from Spencer Chang. And yeah, I guess I'm curious about your general thoughts on how thinking about the internet as an archipelago, or thinking about mapping like these systems as archipelagic, is helpful to you. Like, this is obviously in response to the web seeming centralized and monolithic, as opposed to distributed as the project suggests. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that term, or what other like structures or language have been useful for you to think about, when you map like this Filipino like interdependence online and offline.
Hmm. For me, I think thinking about the archipelago and thinking about the interconnected of like all these little islands that are also very, something about it also feels more fluid and more, I don't know, just that each island is always like shifting, but at the same time, like we're all like still together. And so thinking about like also thinking about, I have this like one channel on experiencing the world as an archipelago, and I think I'm still trying to understand what that means to me, but something about the metaphor just feels good for me. I think it maybe comes from me trying to understand what it means to be from an island, and to not think about things in terms of we're from a continent and we're like separated, but an island just feels more like that metaphor of interconnection. Oh, thanks, Nikki.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, yeah. And when you say that, I can't help but think of the oh, I don't know how to say their name. Nice Bonaventura article on the new word for world is archipelago, which is obviously in response to the Ursula Le Guin story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was actually the article that inspired me as well to create that channel and just understand what that means to me.
Um, okay, I have another question. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on, like, Arena is also changed my life. And for those who aren't familiar with it, we've been dropping links to Arena, right? And it's like, I don't know what an eloquent way to describe it is. Rachel might have a different descriptor, but it's like Pinterest, but for anything. And it's more intentional in terms of like link connecting, and it's usually used by researchers and creatives, so like people in these spheres. But Obviously something that feels a bit inhibiting is that it's very like Western focused. I mean, it's a product developed in the West, and then most of its users come from there. Or another framing is that it comes from use in very like artistic and academic circles, which are inherently like a bit more elitist. And um, I'm curious, like, how do you kind of like mediate like learnings here online in this kind of like amorphous like mostly I guess like Western hegemonic like space and bridge that I guess with your very like on the ground and like material experiences with like Philippine organizations who obviously don't use the same terminology or categorization and but have been doing like very like work that is not like labeled the same.
Mm,
um
yeah. Well, on Arena, I actually have my default as just, I think on Arena, so you can change what is your default homepage, and I actually just keep it to mine so that I go on there when I like kind of want to zone in on my own research. And I think that I actually found a lot of Filipinos on Arena. Like I found you, found Nikki, found Jake and Bianca, and following all your channels were also it felt like my nodal points were all like expanding. And so when I had a lot of questions of like me coming to terms with how I felt connected to my Philippine heritage, a lot of it really came from, honestly, a lot of the research from some of your channels. And so I kind of like built on top of that. And then I think also when I went home to Philippines, it just kind of coincided that there was this workshop that I came across on Instagram. I think it was like one of the, like the ads, but I'm so glad it did because it was a workshop on yeah, Filipino identity, decolonization, but also led by these like nonprofits in the Philippines, led by it was actually by Tayo, like Habilin, their whole organization. And so as I collected what was going on from that workshop and all the resources that they shared, then I would add it to my arena. And so, yeah, my arena is kind of like a gathering of all the influences that I had when I was back home. And so I think it was really such an important time for me to be back home and to learn versus, you know, being back in the States and kind of still feeling that separation.
Now that you're in London, how do you feel you keep yourself like intimate and still proximate to things going on at home?
That is my struggle right now. I'm honestly really, really homesick every day. I think about yeah, every time I see like anything that's going on back home, I feel really homesick. But and I always say like, oh, I just want to be around more Filipino culture because now that I feel like I've grown like I guess a stronger relationship with it, now I'm like, it's even a year is too long being away from home. And I guess how I stay connected is, yeah, by doing some of these projects. So bless the work that I do with Visita because I think that really, really kept me connected. And just the conversations that I would also have with Nikki of, you know, we'd always like share different what's happening in the Philippines, like when she goes to like, different conferences, sharing it with me and just staying updated even though I'm away. And so now when I go back, I'm actually really, really excited to see like how much has changed um, and I really have seen a lot of change as well. Like I've been seeing so many different conferences of like yeah, Filipino Circularity, all these different NGOs and creatives coming together and just more conversations. So I want to be able to attend more of that when I'm back home.
Yeah, and home I'm sure is definitely ready to have you and is eager to have you again. But yeah, the Philippines is filled and flooded with like so many beautiful workshops and residencies and events and fellowships lately. And I'm sure that your Kapitbahay directory that you made with Nikki is going to be an amazing way to start looking around and seeing where these spots are happening. Mm. Are there any other questions from the chat or messages or general comments? Feel free to leave them in. Maybe we have time for a couple more if anyone is interested. Yes, the recording will be sent. We upload all our talks on our YouTube. So if you don't get a notif on email about it, just it will probably be up within the next week. You can just search develop and like Rachel's name and you'll find it and we'll post it on our socials. Yeah, thanks for asking. Everyone asks this all the time and I just like keep forgetting to remind people about the recording.
I can also share the link to the presentation if that's helpful.
Okay, I have a question that I don't know. Yeah, we can close on this unless anyone has any other questions. But um, I am curious on your feelings on just like how material you're interfacing with technology feels, or how like physical or material this process of like circularity tends to be, because there's obviously like are like the ways we choose to use and process with our devices, but then there's also like material aspects, but like minimizing technological use and consumption as a whole. And
Mm,
then another dimension of that is um, I think like a lot of designers who are in the space in the Philippines also feel a lot of tension because, especially for people who are working the web, the
mm,
work is like less material than something that is say like printed on things or like yeah, it's just like physically manifests. Um, so I guess this is just like a general question on your feelings about um, circularity in design, um, and all these general like influences in terms of like how physical the artifacts you make, your workflow and your processes feel. Like, do you see them? Do you think about a digital versus physical divide, or how are you thinking about those boundaries? What informs the other? Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I think I have this interesting relationship with technology, like especially working in tech and then being like, my body feels so tired after staring at my screen for so long. And sometimes after designing for so long, like I don't want to be on the computer anymore. But at the same time, like I sometimes find the process so cool, of like learning the way tech works on the material side. And I don't know, it's also really cool. But I think that I just try to balance a lot of it with, I guess, my outside technology, like my relationship to like my well-being, and trying to find more ways that is outside the computer. Like I've been trying to find like community groups here in London, like visiting community gardens, work that's being done by like trying to figure out like all the different spots around like my neighborhood, going to different like find creating relationships with the people in my favorite spots around my neighborhood. And in a way, I feel like that helps ground me, helps create that balance when my world, most of my day can be taken up by tech.
Yeah, and I wonder like how the question also takes form when we have like a more expansive definition of technology. And maybe I kind of want to like seg into thinking about like your adjacent practices, like for example, your DJing and
Mhm.
your curation, and your practice of gathering. And I mean, if you like take the Le Guin definition of technology as the active human interface with the material world, um, most of our like experimentation and like connection with sound obviously is always technological and very digital. I
Yeah.
find, but then it is obviously a way more embodied and material experience compared to maybe like scrolling on a website, but it still is technology. So I was wondering like how that feels like distinct, or how you did like sound practice feels as like a bridge or as an adjacency to all these practices that you discussed regarding design and circularity.
Yeah. It's interesting too because with design, I think because it can sometimes, be more of my job, like it's a lot more structured and a lot more, um, yeah, a lot more structured. But then with my practice with DJing, I actually want it to be the complete opposite, where the entire process of it, like I just want it to surprise me every time. Like for example, like I'll always just trust that when I'm curating a lot of different sounds and I'm gonna create my next DJ mix, I actually cannot plan it because the more I plan it, the more like I get in my head, and then the more that it just never happens. So DJing and that whole practice has always been a way that I also stay really connected to like my creativity, and then also curating different sounds and then finding different connections from like music in like the 1970s to music in the 1960s, and then like how that shows up in today's music. And yeah, that whole concept of like sampling is also really, really interesting to me. And I guess in a way, like that's also how I like practice like circularity, like always just thinking that um, music is like a portal basically, and I'm always just like tapping into like different time periods and finding ways that I can like weave it together. And also from like sounds all over the world, like I'm very much like curious about why am I called to sounds in like Brazil, for example. Like I've been really obsessed with like Brazilian sounds like bossa nova, and then I found like Filipino bossa nova and like the parallels in the sounds, and like I started thinking about, oh, what were the relationships like? Where did that convergence like happen, and what influenced that convergence? And then started digging into like Filipino soul and like from the 1980s, and then like what was happening around the world. Just yeah, it's music is also a way that like I can navigate throughout like different time periods, and I find it really fun.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. You sounded so passionate in about that, so I'm glad I got to ask this. Yeah, it sounds like there's so much that the world on the web, or regardless of whether it's an indie web movement or a product web movement or whatever one terms it, could imbue so many of these elements into their own practices. Um, like one thing that struck me was you talked about how it's surprising often, like crate digging or like searching or your music practice surprises you. And I feel like that's often missing, right? When working on design and the web. Another thing also is that um sonic things just feel a lot more raw, whereas
Mm,
working on the web, theoretically, like it could bridge these like spatial and temporal gaps, but in effect it ends up obfuscating them more in like unintended ways, that instead like miss out on the people's ability to actually connect things and like draw dots, especially with more algorithmic platforms. um yeah, I don't know, I wish making a website could feel more like listening to music. That makes sense.
mm, yeah. I'm actually reading this book called Quantum Listening, and it talks about how we listen first before we see. And so I've also been trying to like practice listening a lot more, and like really. paying attention. And it was like also talking about like listening in the sense of the sound itself, like whatever sound you're listening to, on that micro scale, but also on the macro scale of like all the surroundings, that is, that encompasses, that sound. So yeah, I haven't gone too far in the book, but it's a great book also talking, it actually talks a lot about, bridging spirituality and technology together too. So yeah, I thought about that when you were mentioning listening. Yes.
Yeah, is it the Pauline Oliveras one? I don't know in the chat, but I don't know if that's the one. Okay. Yeah, it's lovely. And it definitely comes full circle in this talk also, right? I think sound has figured out a lot of these questions about ambience and like our interfacing with the material world and how to make like the entire practice of curation and assemblage and even facilitating the space in which you have your audience and gather them around as like a very like ecological and interdependent and like communal practice. Um, and that seems harder to feel like viscerally on the web. Um, Even though like I don't know, to me personally, like I feel like the computer when I'm on the computer, like I don't say that I need to like do something with my hands and like make a pot or something. Like, oh my God, like this feels physically intense.
Mm,
But I wish it felt more that way often or universally, I guess. Um, yeah, just wanted to share that.
I agree.
Yeah, we can wrap here. Thank you so much, Rachel, for this wonderful talk and all these like threads you've weaved about design and circularity and a bit about your sonic practice. It was such a gift, and I mean, as someone who's been like witnessing you since like pandemic era developed Discord times and seeing how you flourished and have done so much like work with like beautiful communities and now have like your own language with Nikki that I like see like everywhere. I feel your guys' like presence and like impact in the communities around, which is so cool to see. Um this is like yeah, it's such a gift to like have your voice speak on like this immense journey and to see what you're up to lately. And I'm sure we'll all be eagerly waiting for what comes next. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I also want to say thank you again because when I was like in 2021, like I was still trying to build my portfolio, trying to break it into tech and design, but at the same time feeling very like my values weren't aligned. And I think it's really hard when you don't have a container to practice whatever values that are like, calling you. And develop was definitely that, like a perfect container where I actually felt super safe in, like, and also to learn from. And so yeah, this has always been great. And I've always loved coming to the talks. So such an honor to be on one.
Thank you. Super sweet of you. Yeah, develop is only what it is. As it is a community of practice, thanks to people like you. But if anyone else is interested in develop, or visiting Rachel and Nikki's work under Studio Basita or other channels with Rachel's research, there's links in the chat. And there's also the links in the event description and recording will be up. So yeah, just some housekeeping. But is there anything else that you wanted to share? Like any future work or any last notes that you'd like to leave?
Mm, no, actually, I have no future works right now. They're very much in process.
The
Okay,
process is the work. Yeah.
process is the work.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good day, night, wherever you are.
Thank you, everyone.